Arizona sun, didn't just shine. It hammered. It beat down on the Dragoon mountains with a weight you could feel in your teeth, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that warped the horizon. It was a land of silence and spines, where everything from the cactus to the rattlesnake carried a weapon. Sarah Miller wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She was 42 years old, and the frontier had long since etched its story into the corners of her eyes. She wasn't the young, hopeful bride who had come west 15 years ago. That woman was gone, buried alongside a husband and a child in a plot of earth that had grown over with sagebrush. The woman holding the reins now was different. She was a midwife. She was a survivor. And she was tired. The only sound in the canyon was the rhythmic, protesting creak of her buggy's left wheel and the dry hiss of cicadas hidden in the mesquite. It was a lonely sound, the kind that makes you realize just how small you are in a country this big. Sarah shifted on the wooden bench, checking the leather bag at her feet. Inside were clean linens, boiled instruments, and bottles of laudanum, the tools of her trade. She was headed for the piercing cry of a new life at the remote Henderson homestead, 10 miles deeper into the Badlands. But for the last hour, a cold prickle had settled at the base of her neck. She told herself it was just the heat. The mind plays tricks when the mercury rises. But then she saw it. Or rather, she stopped hearing it. The cicadas had gone silent. Sarah pulled back on the reins. Whoa. Bess, easy now. The horse, a sturdy bay mare who had outlived 3 Indian raids and 1 flash flood, tossed her head, her ears swiveling backward. The silence in the canyon wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the canyon walls like water behind a dam. Sarah reached under the seat. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the scattergun she kept wrapped in oilcloth. She didn't draw it. Not yet. She just needed to know it was there. Just the wind. Sarah, she whispered to herself. Just the wind. But the wind had a cruel voice in these parts. It carried secrets. And today, it carried the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. They stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders, 3 of them. They weren't Apaches. They weren't the savages the dime novels warned about. These were white men, dust-caked and grinning with the kind of confidence that only comes from cruelty. They wore the ragged coats of drifters, but they moved with the practiced coordination of wolves. The one in the center, a man with a face like a crumpled map and teeth stained brown, tipped his hat. It was a mocking gesture. Afternoon. Ma'am, he drawled. His voice was like gravel grinding on glass. You're a long way from town to be riding alone. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs, but her hands on the reins remained steady. She sat up straighter, channeling every ounce of the iron she had forged over 20 years of frontier life. I'm expected at the Henderson Ranch, she said, her voice sharp. If I'm not there by sundown, a posse will be out looking. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The man chuckled. Henderson Ranch is 20 miles that way, and I don't think old man Henderson has the spine to ride for anyone. He stepped closer, grabbing the bridle of her horse. Bess whinnied, dancing sideways. Now, why don't you step down? That's a mighty fine horse, and I bet that bag of yours has something to take the edge off a long ride. Let go of the horse, Sarah warned, her hand tightening on the grip of the shotgun beneath the seat. Or what? The man sneered. You gonna slap me? The other 2 men moved in, flanking the buggy. One of them, a younger man with eyes that roamed over Sarah in a way that made her skin crawl. Reached for her boot. "Get down, lady. Don't make us drag you." Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced her resolve. This wasn't a robbery. This was the end. She could see it in their eyes, a darkness that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with malice. She yanked the shotgun free, leveling it at the leader's chest. "Back off," she screamed. The leader didn't flinch. He just laughed. A dry, rattling sound. "Look at that. Boys. She's got claws." He lunged, his hand snatching the barrel of the gun before she could pull the trigger. He wrenched it from her grip with a strength that tore the skin of her palm. Sarah gasped as he tossed the weapon into the dust. "Now," he snarled, his grin vanishing. "You've made me angry." He reached for her, his fingers closing around her wrist like a manacle. Sarah struck out, her free hand clawing at his face. But he was too strong. He dragged her toward the edge of the buggy, the ground rushing up to meet her. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact, waiting for the pain. But the pain didn't come. Instead, the air split open. Thwack. It was a wet, heavy sound. The grip on her wrist vanished instantly. Sarah opened her eyes. The leader was stumbling backward, his hands clutching at a feathered shaft protruding from his shoulder. He looked down at it, confusion warring with shock on his face. Before he collapsed to his knees in the red dirt, the other two men spun around, guns drawn, their eyes scanning the high ridges of the canyon. "Where is he?" one shouted, panic cracking his voice. "Where?" Thwack. A second arrow took the younger man in the thigh, pinning him to the wheel of the buggy. He screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed off the stone walls. Sarah sat frozen, her breath caught in a throat tight with terror. She looked up, high above them. Standing on a jagged outcropping of red rock was a silhouette against the blinding sun. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood with the stillness of a predator who has already won the hunt. It was an Apache. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his long black hair bound back, stripped to the waist despite the heat. He held a bow in one hand, loose and easy, as if it were an extension of his own arm. He wasn't wearing war paint, but his face was terrifying. It was hard to read, carved in shadow and dusk, etched with lines of a war that had never ended. This was not a rescuer. This was judgment. The last standing outlaw fired blindly at the ridge, his bullet chipping the rock feet below the warrior. The Apache didn't even flinch. He moved with a fluid grace, slipping an arrow from his quiver and drawing the bow in one smooth motion. The outlaw turned to run, but he was too slow. The arrow caught him in the back, dropping him face first into the sagebrush. Silence crashed back into the canyon, heavier than before. Sarah stared up at the ridge, her heart thundering like a trapped bird. The warrior lowered his bow, his eyes sharp, dark, and alive, locked onto hers. He didn't look at her with lust, or pity, or even curiosity. He looked at her like a hawk sighting prey. He began to descend the rocks, moving silently, the loose stones not even shifting under his moccasins. As he got closer, Sarah saw the necklace of claws hanging around his neck, jagged scar running down his forearm. He stopped 10 feet from the buggy. The smell of blood and gunpowder hung in the stagnant air. He looked at the groaning men on the ground. then stepped over them, as if they were nothing more than fallen logs. He walked straight to Sarah. She pressed her back against the buggy seat, her hands trembling. She had heard the stories. She knew what men like this did to women alone in the desert. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stopped. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the wind, ignoring her plea. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, rough-edged, and commanding. "You are loud," he said. His English was clipped, harsh. "You bring wolves to my door." Sarah blinked, confused. They attacked me because you are weak," he stated simply. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation, cold and clinical. He reached out, his hand moving toward her. Sarah flinched, expecting violence, but he didn't strike her. He grabbed the reins of her horse, calming the panicked animal with a single, firm touch. "Get down," he ordered. My things." Sarah stammered. He turned his gaze on her again, and for a moment, the mask of stone slipped. She saw something ancient and weary in his eyes. "Leave them," he said. He pointed to the sky, where dark clouds were beginning to pile up over the mountains, turning the horizon to a bruise-colored haze. "The sky bleeds. The water comes. If you stay, the river takes you." Sarah looked up. She hadn't noticed the storm building, but he had. "I can't leave my wagon," she protested, a spark of her old stubbornness flaring. The warrior stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Then you die with it." He turned and began to walk away, dissolving back into the landscape as if he were made of the dust itself. Sarah looked at the dead men, then at the darkening sky, and finally at the retreating back of the Apache. She realized then that the trap hadn't been the bandits. The trap was the canyon itself, and the only way out was following the monster who called it home. Sarah Miller grabbed her medical bag, jumped from the buggy, and ran to catch up with the shadow. Sarah scrambled over the scree, her boots sliding on the loose shale, her breath coming in ragged, hot gasps. She had managed to snatch her shotgun from the dust where the bandit had thrown it, and its weight was heavy in her hands, a cold, iron comfort that felt increasingly useless against the vastness of this place. Ahead of her, the Apache moved like smoke. He didn't stumble. He didn't look back. He simply flowed over the terrain, a part of the landscape itself. "Wait!" Sarah shouted, the word torn from her throat. He stopped. He didn't turn slowly. He spun, sharp and sudden. He was 10 paces ahead, standing on a shelf of red rock that overlooked the dry wash where her buggy sat abandoned. Sarah raised the shotgun. Her arms shook, not just from the weight, but from the terrifying realization of who she was pointing it at. This was a man whose people had been hunted like wolves, and who hunted back with equal ferocity. I won't go with you," she stammered, trying to steady the barrel. "I'll take my chances walking back to town." The warrior looked at the gun, then up at her face. His expression didn't change. There was no fear, only a deep, weary boredom. He looked at the weapon the way a mountain might look at a pebble. "Go back, healer woman," he said, his voice low enough to slide under the rising wind. "Death walks this canyon, and he does not care for your iron stick." "I'm not afraid of you," she lied. "You should be," he replied, "but not of me." He lifted a hand, pointing past her. back down the canyon toward the south. Listen, Sarah hesitated, keeping the gun trained on his chest. But she tilted her head. At first, there was only the wind, whining through the needles of the saguaro. But then she heard it. A low, vibrating rumble. It wasn't thunder, it was too constant, too rhythmic. It sounded like a freight train buried deep beneath the earth, grinding its way to the surface. The air pressure dropped so fast, her ears popped. The smell hit her a second later, a thick, overpowering scent of wet creosote, ozone, and pulverized stone. It was the smell of the monsoon. The water comes, he said. The sky is clear, Sarah argued, glancing up. Above them, the sun still blazed. But to the south, a wall of charcoal-black clouds had devoured the mountains. The storm is miles away, the Apache said, turning his back on her gun. The water is here. He didn't wait for her to understand. He lunged. Sarah shrieked, her finger tightening on the trigger. But he was too fast. He didn't strike her. He grabbed the strap of her medical bag and the fabric of her dress at the shoulder, hauling her off her feet. Move, he barked, the command cracking like a whip. He dragged her, not away from the canyon, but up. He shoved her toward a fissure in the canyon wall. A steep, jagged climb up the red sandstone. Let go of me, she fought him, striking at his chest, panic blinding her. Look, he shouted, grabbing her face with a rough hand and forcing her to look down into the wash. And then she saw it. It came around the bend like a living thing, a wall of churning, brown violence. It wasn't water. It was a slurry of mud, uprooted trees, boulders the size of cows, and the wreckage of the world. The flash flood roared with a voice that drowned out her own scream. It hit her buggy with the force of a cannonball. Sarah watched in horror as the sturdy vehicle, the thing that had carried her safely for years, was smashed into splinters in a heartbeat. The wheels were torn off, the wood shattered, the entire thing swallowed whole by the brown torrent. If she had been standing there, if she had stayed to argue, she would be nothing but bone and memory. The water rose instantly, lapping hungrily at the rocks where they had stood just seconds ago. Up, the warrior growled in her ear. Higher, the indifference was gone. Now, there was only urgency. He pushed her ahead of him, his hand firm on her back, guiding her handholds. Sarah climbed. She climbed until her fingernails broke and her lungs burned. The roar of the water below was deafening, a physical vibration that shook the rock face against her chest. They reached a narrow ledge, 20 feet above the floodline, obscured by a curtain of hanging mesquite roots. Behind the roots was the dark mouth of a cave. The Apache shoved her inside, then followed, collapsing against the stone wall. For a long moment, there was no sound but the thunder of the water outside and the ragged, tearing sound of their own breathing. The cave was small, cool, and dim. It smelled of ancient dust and damp sage. Sarah sat huddled against the far wall, her knees drawn to her chest, the shotgun abandoned somewhere on the ledge below. She was shaking a violent, uncontrollable trembling that started in her core. She stared at the man across from her. In the dim light, he looked less like a monster and more like a statue that had been knocked over. He sat with his legs stretched out, head leaned back against the stone, eyes closed. His chest heaved. They were trapped. The water outside wouldn't recede for hours. Maybe until morning. She was alone in the dark with a man the territory called a devil. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was small, swallowed by the echo of the cave. "You could have left me." He opened his eyes. In the gloom, they were obsidian, unreadable, bottomless. "The storm takes what it wants," he murmured. "I do not help it." It wasn't kindness. It was a code she didn't understand. Sarah shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard floor. As she moved, her eyes adjusted to the shadows. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, without the lens of terror. He was powerful. Yes, his arms were corded with muscle. His skin, the color of the canyon walls outside. But he was also human. He was covered in the dust of the struggle. And there was something else. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the leather of his leggings. High up on the thigh, she remembered the gunfire. The bandit's bullet. He had been shot before he even came down the ridge. He had climbed that rock face, dragged her weight, and outrun a flood. All with a bullet in his leg. He hadn't made a sound. Sarah watched him. His face was a mask of stoic calm. But she saw the way his hand gripped his knee, the knuckles white. She saw the sheen of cold sweat on his upper lip that had nothing to do with the heat. The fear in her chest began to recede, replaced by something sharper, something more familiar. It was the instinct that had driven her for 20 years. The instinct that made her ride into blizzards to deliver babies and set bones by lantern light. She wasn't just a captive. She wasn't just a widow. She was a healer. And he was bleeding. The warrior shifted. A low, barely audible hiss of breath escaping his teeth. He turned his head away from her, hiding the pain, refusing to show weakness to a white woman. Sarah looked at her hands. They were dirty, scraped, and trembling. But they were capable. She looked at her medical bag, miraculously still clutched in her left hand. She hadn't even realized she was holding it. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah Miller unclasped the leather buckle of the bag. The click was loud in the small space. The Apache's eyes snapped open. He watched her, his body tense, ready to spring. Sarah didn't retreat. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached inside and pulled out a clean roll of cotton and a bottle of stinging spirit. "You're bleeding," she said softly. "I am fine." He grunted, closing his eyes again. "You're a terrible liar," Sarah replied, her voice gaining a fraction of its old steel. She shuffled forward on her knees, moving into the space between them. The intimacy of it, the closeness was sudden and jarring. She could smell the rain on his skin, the scent of pine smoke and leather. He stiffened as she got closer, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "Don't," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'm not going to hurt you, but that leg needs tending, or the fever will take you before the soldiers do." He looked at the bottle in her hand, then at her face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Outside, the flood raged on, tearing the world apart. But inside, in the quiet dark, a different kind of barrier was breaking, slowly, inches at a time. Cheveyo took his hand off his knife. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. Once, Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She reached out, her pale hand hovering over his dark, scarred skin. And as the storm screamed its fury outside, she prepared to touch the enemy. The cave was a small pocket of silence within the roar of the storm. Outside, The floodwaters churned with the violence of a breaking world, grinding boulders into sand. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the sharp, medicinal tang of alcohol. Sarah hovered over the warrior, her hands trembling not from fear anymore, but from the sheer audacity of what she was doing. She was a white woman, a settler, kneeling in the dust beside a man the territory called a demon. Preparing to put her hands on him, Cheveyo watched her. His eyes were dark slits, tracking her every movement, like a wolf cornered in a den. When she uncorked the bottle of spirits, the smell hit him, and his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. He shifted, his hand instinctively moving to push her away. "No," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, but it held the steel of 20 years on the frontier. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She met his gaze with a defiance that surprised them both. "I am a healer. I don't care whose blood it is. Blood is blood." She reached out and took his wrist, her fingers pale and slender against the dark, weathered copper of his skin. It was a jarring contrast, the hand of a woman who birthed babies touching the arm of a man who dealt death. He could have snapped her wrist in a heartbeat. He could have ended her there in the dark. But he didn't. He let out a slow, ragged breath and released his grip on the knife at his belt. He leaned his head back against the stone wall, surrendering not to her, but to the necessity of survival. Sarah worked quickly. She poured the spirits onto a clean cloth. "This will burn," she warned. "Do it." He grunted. She pressed the cloth to the furrow in his thigh. His body seized, every muscle locking rigid as iron. A sharp hiss of air escaped through his clenched teeth, and his hand gripped a loose stone on the floor so hard she thought it might crumble. But he didn't cry out. He didn't pull away. He took the pain as if it were an old friend, something he had known all his life. As she cleaned the wound, Sarah's fear began to dissolve into the rhythm of her work. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her hands were steady, gentle, moving with the practiced grace of a woman who had stitched up ranch hands and delivered breech babies by the light of a tallow candle. She touched the scars that mapped his body, faint white lines on his ribs, a jagged tear on his shoulder. This was a body written in violence, a history book of battles she couldn't imagine. And yet, beneath her fingers, the skin was warm. It was human. She bound the leg with a strip of clean linen, tying it tight. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping a stray lock of hair from her face. "It needs rest," she said, her voice soft in the gloom. "If you walk on it tomorrow, it will open again." Cheveyo opened his eyes. The obsidian hardness was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet curiosity. He looked at the white bandage against his dark skin, then up at her face. "You have strong hands," he said. The words were heavy, unfamiliar in his mouth. "For a woman of the soft places, I haven't lived in a soft place for a long time," Sarah replied. Night fell over the canyon, bringing a profound darkness that felt like a physical weight. The temperature plummeted, the desert shedding its heat the moment the sun vanished. Cheveyo, moving with a stiffness he tried to hide, gathered dried sagebrush and driftwood that had been blown into the cave mouth years ago. With a flint and steel, he struck a spark. A small fire crackled to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the cave walls. The orange light softened the sharp angles of his face, making him look younger, less like a monument to war. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames a flickering border between their worlds. "Why?" he asked suddenly. He was staring into the fire, breaking a twig between his fingers. "Why do you ride alone? A woman with no man, no children." The question was blunt, stripping away the polite veneer of settler society. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked past him, into the dark mouth of the cave. "I had a child," she whispered. "A son." His name was William. The warrior went still. He didn't interrupt. He waited, giving her the space to speak the dead's name. It wasn't the fever, and it wasn't the war. Sarah continued, her voice hollow. "It was a breech birth. I was out at the homestead, alone. My husband had gone for the doctor. But the rains came. The river rose." She looked at Cheveyo. Just like today, the fire popped, a spark drifting upward. "The doctor never came. My husband never came. By the time the water went down, William was gone, and I was empty." She looked down at her hands, the hands that had saved so many others, but failed the one that mattered most. "That's why I ride," she said, her voice gaining strength. "That's why I became a midwife. Because I couldn't save him. So I saved the others. Every cry of a new baby. It's like hearing him again." Just for a second, silence stretched between them. But it wasn't the fearful silence of the afternoon. It was a shared silence. The silence of grief. Cheveyo nodded slowly. He understood this. He understood that grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you carried. Like a pack that never gets lighter, only more familiar. "My people say the dead do not leave us," he said quietly. "They live in the wind. They live in the thunder." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flames. "I fight for them. Not for the living." Sarah frowned, confused. "But the soldiers, the telegraph lines, they say the war is ending. They say you can't win." Cheveyo let out a short, bitter laugh. "Win?" He shook his head. "No, we cannot win. The white eyes are like the locusts. You kill one, and 10 more come. You build fences across the earth as if you can own the dirt." He picked up a handful of red dust from the cave floor and let it slip through his fingers. "I do not fight to win. Healer woman, I fight to remember. I fight so that when the last Apache is gone, the land will still know we were here. They can take the rivers, they can take the mountains, but they cannot take the song of the wind. As long as I fight, the song remains." It was a confession of doom, spoken with the calm of a saint. He knew he was a dead man walking. He knew his world was ending. And yet, he refused to go quietly. Sarah looked at him, and the last of her fear evaporated. She didn't see a savage. She didn't see an enemy. She saw a man holding up the sky with his bare hands, knowing it was going to crush him, but refusing to let go. "You're not a monster," she whispered. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You're just a ghost." Cheveyo looked at her. Then, the barrier was gone. He saw her not as a white invader, but as a mother with an empty heart. A warrior in her own right, who fought death with boiling water and clean linen. "You have fire in you," he murmured. "Deep down, where the wind cannot blow it out." He reached into the small pouch at his waist and pulled out a piece of dried meat, offering it to her. It was a gesture of peace. A breaking of bread. Eat, he said. The night is long. Ish kaine. Sarah took the food. Her fingers brushed his again. And this time, neither of them pulled away. Ish kaine? She asked. What does that mean? A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It softened the scar on his cheek, making him breathtakingly handsome in the firelight. It is a name, he said, turning back to the flames. For someone who walks through the flood and does not drown, the narrator's voice lowered. Intimate and warm. He wouldn't tell her then. But in the tongue of the Chiricahua, it meant brave one, or perhaps, more accurately, she who refuses to die. Sarah leaned back against the cold stone wall, watching the firelight dance across his features. Outside, the storm still raged, a chaotic symphony of destruction. But in here, with the smell of sage smoke and the quiet presence of the man who was supposed to be her enemy, Sarah Miller felt something she hadn't felt in 10 lonely years. She felt safe. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. And for the first time in a decade, she slept without dreaming of the empty crib. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, not with a whisper, but with a shout of color. The sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the wet sandstone in violent shades of crimson, burnt orange, and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean, smelling of wet sage and the sharp, electric scent of ozone. For a heartbeat, the canyon felt like the first morning of creation. The floodwaters had receded to a muddy ribbon far below, leaving the wash scoured and empty. In the mouth of the cave, the fire had burned down to cold white ash. Sarah stood at the edge of the ledge, watching the light creep down the canyon walls. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, her hands stained with the dust of the cave. She felt exhausted. Yes, but also strangely new. The fear that had defined her life for so long, the fear of being alone. The fear of the wild was gone. It had been washed away by the rain and the silence of the man standing beside her. Cheveyo was already awake. He stood near the entrance, his body tense, his eyes scanning the valley floor below. He hadn't moved for an hour. He was listening to things Sarah couldn't hear: the shift of gravel, the cry of a jay, the breath of the land. It's beautiful, Sarah whispered, stepping up beside him. It is a lie, he said softly. He didn't point. He didn't have to. Sarah followed his gaze down to the canyon floor, where the shadows still clung to the earth. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a flash of metal, the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. Movement separated itself from the rocks. A horse shook its mane. Then another. Then a hat, battered and stained. Silas Thorne had returned. And he hadn't come alone. There were 6 of them now. A posse of hard men, trackers, and hired guns, moving slowly up the slope. They weren't looking at the sky. They were looking at the ground. They found the blood, Cheveyo said, his voice devoid of emotion. The rain did not wash it all away. Sarah's stomach turned over. She looked at the bandage on his leg. A single drop of bright red had soaked through the linen during the night. A breadcrumb trail leading right to their door. They're trapping us, she said, her voice rising. No, Cheveyo corrected. He turned to her. And for the first time, His face showed a flicker of pain. Not physical pain, but the agony of a choice he had already made. They trapped me. He pressed his Winchester rifle into her hands. It was heavy. The woodstock warmed from his grip. "Take this," he ordered. "The path behind the cave leads to the upper rim. It is steep, but you can climb it. Go to the river. Follow it north. Do not stop." Sarah stared at the gun, then at him. "What are you talking about?" "I will go down," he said, drawing his knife with his left hand. "I will draw their fire. When they look at me, you run. They will not chase a white woman if they have the Apache wolf." He was offering to die. Just like that? A simple trade. His life for hers. He spoke of it as if it were a business transaction. A necessary balancing of the scales. "No," Sarah said. Cheveyo frowned, his brow furrowing. "You do not understand. They will kill me slowly, but they will let you live if you are not with me." "They won't," Sarah snapped. "You saw their eyes yesterday. They aren't here for justice, Cheveyo. They're here for sport. And I am done running." She shoved the rifle back into his chest. He caught it instinctively. "I didn't pull you out of that flood and stitch your leg back together just to watch you throw your life away," she said, her voice shaking with a fierce, sudden anger. She walked over to where her shotgun lay against the cave wall, the weapon she had carried for 10 years. The weapon her husband had taught her to use. She broke it open, checking the shells, and snapped it shut with a sound that echoed like a gavel in the small space. She walked back to the ledge and stood beside him. "If they want us," she said, looking him in the eye, "they're going to have to come up here and take us. Both of us." Cheveyo looked at her. He looked at the set of her jaw, the fire in her pale eyes, the way she held the weapon not like a tool, but like a part of herself. "You are foolish," he whispered, but there was no scolding in the word. It sounded like a prayer. "Ishkaine." Below them, a voice echoed up the canyon walls. "We know you're up there, boy." It was Thorn. His voice was cheerful, mocking. "And we know you got the lady. Send her down. And maybe we'll make it quick for you." A bullet cracked against the stone inches from Sarah's head, spraying rock dust into her hair. The Ziga had begun. Cheveyo didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, leveled the Winchester, and fired. The shot rang out, sharp and clear. Below, one of the men yelled and scrambled behind a boulder, his hat flying off. "Back," Cheveyo commanded. "Into the rocks." They retreated from the open ledge into the cover of the fallen boulders at the cave's mouth. It was a natural fortress, offering narrow slits to fire through, while protecting them from the storm of lead that erupted from below. Bullets hammered the cliff face, whining off the stone like angry hornets. The air filled instantly with the smell of pulverized rock and burnt powder. "Watch the left," Cheveyo shouted over the roar. Sarah shifted, swinging her shotgun toward the narrow trail on the left side of the ascent. Two of Thorn's men were trying to flank them, scrabbling up the loose shale. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She aimed for the rock just above them and pulled the trigger. The scattergun roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. The rock exploded, sending a shower of razor-sharp shale raining down on the climbers. They shouted, losing their footing and sliding back down the slope in a cloud of dust. "Good," Cheveyo yelled. He racked the lever of his rifle, firing 2 shots in rapid succession at the main group below. For 10 minutes, The world was nothing but noise and smoke. It was chaos. But within the chaos, something miraculous happened. They began to move as one. They didn't need to speak. Sarah knew when he was reloading. She would step forward, firing to keep the men's heads down. When she needed to break the shotgun to reload, Cheveyo was there, his rifle singing death. Covering her, they were back to back in the dust. Two outcasts from different worlds, forged into a single weapon by necessity. Sarah felt a strange, terrifying exhilaration. She wasn't the widow in the empty house anymore. She wasn't the victim. She was fighting for her life. And she was fighting for him. Thorn was getting frustrated. His men were pinned. 2 were wounded. And the sun was getting higher, heating the rocks to a blistering temperature. "Burn 'em out," Thorn screamed from behind a slab of sandstone. "Get the oil. They are coming close." Cheveyo rasped. His face was streaked with sweat and soot, his chest heaving. The wound in his leg was bleeding freely now, soaking the bandage. But he stood steady as a mountain. "I have 2 shells left," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Make them count," he replied. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the ledge. One of the men had managed to climb the sheer face while they were distracted. He pulled himself up, a revolver in his hand, a grin of triumph on his face. He was 10 feet away. Sarah turned, but her shotgun was empty. The man raised his gun. "Gotcha." Cheveyo dropped his rifle. He didn't have time to aim. He launched himself across the gap, tackling the man with the force of a striking panther. They hit the ground hard, rolling toward the edge of the cliff. The man was heavy, desperate, striking out with the pistol barrel. Cheveyo grunted as the metal struck his wounded leg. But he didn't let go. He fought with a savage, silent intensity, his hand clamping around the man's wrist, forcing the gun away. Sarah scrambled for a rock. Anything to help? But it was over in seconds. Cheveyo twisted the man's arm with a sickening crunch, then shoved him hard. The man scrambled for purchase on the loose gravel, eyes wide with terror, before sliding over the edge. His scream faded into the canyon below. Cheveyo collapsed back onto the ledge, gasping for air. Below, the firing stopped. Thorn's men had seen their comrade fall. The silence that followed was heavy. Stunned, "They are pulling back," Sarah whispered, peering over the rim. She saw the men retreating down the slope, dragging their wounded, mounting their horses. Silas Thorn looked up one last time, his face a mask of hate, before turning his horse. "We did it," Sarah breathed, a laugh bubbling up in her throat. She crawled over to Cheveyo, reaching for his shoulder. "Cheveyo, we did it." "They're running." But Cheveyo wasn't looking at the retreating posse. He was looking north, toward the open plains beyond the canyon mouth. His body was rigid, his expression grim. "No," he said softly. "They do not run from us." Sarah followed his gaze. And then she heard it, faint at first, but growing stronger. A sound distinct from the wind. Not the disorganized clatter of a posse, but a rhythmic, disciplined thunder. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Hundreds of hooves. Then came the sound that chilled the blood of every free soul in the territory. The sharp, brassy call of a bugle. "The army," Sarah whispered, her blood turning to ice. They heard the shooting. Cheveyo struggled to his feet, using the cave wall for support. He looked at the dust cloud rising in the north. Thorn was just the biting dog, he said, his voice heavy with finality. Now comes the hunter. He turned to Sarah. The adrenaline of the battle was fading, leaving only the stark, brutal truth of their reality. They had fought off a few bandits, but they could not fight the United States Cavalry. The time for fighting is done. Ishkaine, he said gently. Now comes the time for running. The sound of the bugle cut through the canyon air again. Closer this time. It was a sharp, brassy intrusion that shattered the fragile victory they had just won. The dust from the bandits' retreat hadn't even settled. And already, the next wave of violence was cresting the horizon. Sarah looked at Cheveyo. He was leaning against the rock wall, favoring his wounded leg, his chest heaving, but his eyes were clear. He was looking at her not as a warrior looks at a liability, but as a man looks at the only thing in the world he cannot keep. The silence between them was heavy with the things they didn't need to say. They both knew the law of the land. If the soldiers found Sarah Miller here, fighting beside an Apache, holding a smoking shotgun, there would be no trial. She would be branded a traitor. She would hang, and if Cheveyo stayed, if he let himself be taken to save her, he would rot in a cage at San Carlos. For a spirit like his, that was a fate far worse than the bullet. Go, he said. It wasn't a command anymore. It was a plea. I can't, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow ache in her chest. I can't just walk away. Not after this. Cheveyo pushed himself off the wall. He limped toward her, ignoring the pain, ignoring the approaching thunder of the cavalry. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He reached up, his hand moving to the leather thong, binding his hair. With a quick, decisive tug, he pulled it free. A small, rough-cut turquoise stone swung from the strip of rawhide. It was the color of the sky before the storm bright, clear, and enduring. He took her left hand. His fingers were rough, stained with earth and blood, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He wrapped the leather around her wrist, tying it in a knot that would not slip. You are part of the canyon now, Sarah, he murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest. He looked deep into her eyes, searing the moment into her memory. Even when you are old and gray, even when you sleep in a soft bed in a stone house, the wind will know your name. Sarah looked down at the blue stone against her pale skin. A sob caught in her throat. She looked up, desperate, to memorize the lines of his face, the scar on his jaw, the depth of his eyes, the way he stood against the light. Cheveyo. She breathed. She didn't wait. She couldn't. Before the moment could shatter, Sarah reached out, tangling her fingers in his dark hair, and pulled him down to her. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was searing. It tasted of salt and dust and the terrifying beautiful realization that they were two souls who had found each other at the very edge of the world. It was a kiss of goodbye, filled with all the words they would never get to speak, promises of a life they would never get to live. For a heartbeat, the war didn't exist. The cavalry didn't exist. There was only the heat of him, the strength of his arms around her, anchoring her to the earth one last time. Then, he pulled away. His forehead rested against hers for a second of fleeting, intimate benediction. Ride north, he whispered against her skin. Live, he turned and vaulted onto the back of the horse the bandit had left behind. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he would never leave. He kicked the horse into a gallop, riding not away from the danger, but toward the rising sun, up the ridge and into the blinding light. Sarah stood alone on the ledge, her hand clutching the turquoise stone at her wrist, watching him go. One moment, he was a man of flesh and blood. The next, he was just a silhouette against the fire of the dawn. And then, he was gone, vanished, like smoke, like a spirit returning to the stone. The only thing left was the sound of the wind, whispering her name. The seasons turned, as they always do, indifferent to the hearts of men. 20 winters passed over the Arizona territory. The wild trails where lonely buggies once creaked were now paved with cobblestones. The silence of the canyons was broken by the shrill whistle of trains and the hum of telegraph wires, stitching the open wound of the frontier into something resembling civilization. Sarah Miller was no longer the desperate widow stranded in the flood. She was Grandmother Sarah now, the town's matriarch. Her hair was the color of winter frost, and lines of laughter and hard-won wisdom were etched deep around her eyes. She had never remarried. The townspeople whispered that she had given her heart to the ghost of her first husband, and she never corrected them. On a cool evening in late November, Sarah sat on her porch, a heavy quilt tucked around her legs. Her garden was asleep for the winter, but the scent of dried rosemary still lingered in the air. A little girl, no older than 7, climbed onto the swing beside her. It was her niece's daughter, bright-eyed and curious. The child reached out, her small, soft fingers tracing the object Sarah wore on her left wrist. It was an old, weathered strip of leather, holding a single piece of turquoise. The stone was worn smooth, polished to a shine by 20 years of touch, of holding it like a prayer in the dark. "Grandma," the child asked, tilting her head, "why do you never take this off? Mommy says you have gold bracelets in your box. This one is just an old rock." Sarah looked down at the stone. She didn't see a rock. She saw the flash of a storm. She felt the heat of a cave. She tasted the dust of a goodbye that had never really ended. "It's not just a rock, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, her voice raspy with age. "It's a map to where." Sarah looked up. She looked past the manicured fences of the town, past the church steeple, all the way to the jagged, blood-red silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains burning against the sunset. They hadn't changed. They were still wild, silent, and eternal. She didn't feel lonely. In the quiet of the evening, she felt a presence as familiar as her own heartbeat. A shadow that moved with the wind. She smiled. "A secret, tender thing. To a place where the rain meets the earth," she whispered. "Some loves are a fire that burns the house down. But some are the stars that guide you home. And out there, in the silence, I know the shadow still watches. Thank you for journeying with us through the canyons today." Stories like Sarah and Cheveyo's remind us that even in the harshest landscapes, the human heart can find a way to bloom. I'd love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you sitting on a porch in Kentucky, watching the snow fall? Or maybe you're driving through the rain in Oregon. Share your thoughts and your location in the comments below. I read every single one, and it makes our campfire feel a little bigger. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with a friend who believes in a love that lasts. And if you haven't already, Please subscribe to Echoes of the West. We have many more trails to ride together. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.